Welcome to Philosophy Podcast. I'm August Baker. Today, we're talking about Thoreau's Acts, Distraction and Discipline in American Culture. I'll just read the blurb here. It's how 19th century disciplines of attention anticipated the contemporary concern with mindfulness and being, quote, spiritual but not religious. Today, we're driven to distraction, our attention overwhelmed by the many demands upon it, most of which emanate from our beeping and blinking digital devices. This may seem like a decidedly 21st century problem, but as Caleb Smith shows in his elegantly written meditative work, distraction was also a serious concern in American culture 2 centuries ago. In Thoreau's Acts, Smith explores the strange, beautiful archives of the 19th century attention revival, from a Protestant minister's warning against frivolous thoughts to Thoreau's reflection on wakefulness at Walden Pond. Smith examines how Americans came to embrace attention, mindfulness, and other ways of being, quote, spiritual but not religious, and how older Christian ideas about temptation and spiritual devotion endure in our modern ideas about distraction and attention. And one endorsement from Rachel Kushner: Smith has the deep and natural orientation of a historian in his approach to archives and strange and curious corners of 19th century American thought. Caleb Smith is professor of English at Yale University. He's the author of The Prison and the American Imagination, The Oracle and the Curse, and the editor of The Life and the Adventures of a Haunted Conflict. Welcome, Professor Caleb. Glad to talk to you today. I really enjoyed this book.
Thank you so much. Thank you for reading it, and thanks for the invitation to talk with you.
I guess, in the blurb, it talked about how we can see these older Christian ideas about temptation and spiritual devotion endure. That was a big part of your book, I think.
It is. Yeah. I mean, the book deals mostly with the culture of the U.S. in the first half of the 19th century. And it's a time when Christian traditions are being adapted to and challenged by a whole set of modernizing forces having to do with the industrial economy, the market economy, political democracy, and certain kinds of secular knowledge and culture as well. So in what ways is our own sort of effort to cultivate better attentiveness an extension, a revival of older kind of devotional practices that were designed to connect the believer to the spiritual or to God? To what extent are our ways of trying to create better attentiveness actually artifacts of the modern or artifacts of a secularization process? That's part of the kind of historical question that is asking.
Right. So do you think of, I was looking at this book by Stanley Cavell on Thoreau, and he's looking at, this time trying to find an originary American text. That this would be a time in the 1800s when you could find something about what it is to be an American before at its inception. Does that make sense to you? Does that resonate for you?
Well, I mean, I think it is a time when there is a kind of question in literary culture, like among magazine editors and book editors and people who are involved in the publishing industry and in what we might later come to call a culture industry, to think, what is American culture? What is American literature? How is it distinct? And there is a sense among a number of writers that I think Walt Whitman would be a great example of this, that there has been a kind of political independence without cultural independence, or that Americans are still sort of preoccupied by or enthralled by European culture, English culture in particular. They're reading Charles Dickens all the time, for instance. And so, this is partly has to do with even just questions of international copyright and who makes money from the sale of a book. But it also is a matter of, the development of a national political culture, which in some ways would not, you could say, really happen until the end of the Civil War. I'm mostly dealing with the decades before the Civil War. And Thoreau's an interesting figure in this. I mean, I think he has been maybe especially retrospectively seen as having written in Walden something like a quintessentially American book.
Right.
And, there are references in the book to the 4th of July, for instance, or his act of civil disobedience has to do with his relation to the federal government. But at the same time, it's a kind of regional and local book that's about New England as his country, or even Massachusetts as his country, about the town of Concord and its people and its culture. And then it also has, I think, a broader horizon that extends out to South Asian spiritual traditions and a kind of global horizon of culture. So I think there are reasons for seeing Thoreau as peculiarly American, but it's not always clear that he saw himself in that way. And he certainly saw himself as a kind of outsider to his own community. And so there's a kind of paradox in American literature where often, and American culture more broadly maybe, where the one who has a kind of alienation or is an outsider or a rebel then gets claimed as representative of the nation, which also likes to see itself as rebellious and free and so on.
So, I was thinking this morning, I was going to ask you about Thoreau being a French name. And then I started thinking about it, and I was reminded of a conversation I had with Stephanie Lee about her book, Ugly White People. She was talking about J.D. Vance's book and how he, Hillbilly Elegy, and how he says he's not white, or he's not a WASP. He says, I'm a Scots-Irish.
Right.
And there's a way in which I think Stephanie Lee points this out, that, there's a way in which people respond to Black versus white and will focus on part of their whiteness to try to, I think I did that. I became very interested in my so-called Irish background, which is really there. But I mean, it's hard to read anybody today without thinking about their background. And Thoreau is white. You're not restricted to white people here. But how do you approach that? His Frenchness, his whiteness, and that of all the other white authors in the book.
Yeah, I think Thoreau would have seen himself probably as white in the culture of his time. He did have kind of relation to this French Huguenot heritage. He also was in a situation in Massachusetts where he's living out there at Walden among, Irish laborers, among formerly enslaved people. There's still an indigenous community there. And so, he does have a racialized identity that allows him, I think it'd be fair to say that it allows him to have a feeling of outsiderhood that is not a feeling of abjection or being the target of legal and political and economic violence in the way that some of those other communities are. I mean, when he goes to jail for his civil disobedience, for instance, I do think he takes it for granted that he's going to be treated with a certain amount of respect, that his rights and liberties are going to be respected. So he is not vulnerable in the same way that some other people might be in that situation. That's one place where his sort of whiteness is in effect. But there's also, I think, for him and for a number of the writers in the book, their whiteness is being sort of worked through not only in relation to Blackness, but also in relation to the indigenous populations around.
That's a very good point. I didn't realize that. Yeah, that living in the woods, there were these different populations.
Yeah, and for a number of the people in the book, the whiteness, and it's by way of its association with civilization and modernity and so on, also comes to be understood partly as a fallenness from the capacity to be attuned to nature, attentive to nature, and so on, in the way that the sort of romanticized version of the indigenous community is that they still have this capacity to interact with nature in a way that white people have become estranged from.
Right. So the book is Thoreau's Acts, Distraction and Discipline in American Culture. And I was looking at the word, I never really paid attention to the word distraction. I guess it means to draw in different directions.
Mm-hmm.
But very early on, it was used to talk about the mind, drawing of the mind from one course to another. Do you think it has a similar meaning then as it does today?
That's a good question. And in a way, that's sort of the provocation of the book, is to say, when these writers say distraction or when they say attention, are we continuous with them? And I think the answer is both yes and no. I mean, I quote the definition of distraction that I deal with most in the book is probably from Webster's Dictionary of American English, and that's I think what you were just quoting from there. And it's more or less recognizable to us, that your mind is not just on one thing, but kind of divided against itself or pulled in multiple directions. You have a hard time staying focused on one thing. Your mind is wandering. The wandering mind is a big figure of distraction, which is coming out of religious tradition. So, and it is related for them to technology and even to media technology, but they don't have the same media technology that we do. But when Thoreau says something like, read not the times, read the eternities, and he means the times in the sense of the newspaper, he's talking about the distraction of daily news. The penny press, pamphlet literature, and all of that kind of stuff is the mass media of its time, and they do describe it as a distraction from more enduring or deeper or more lasting kinds of things that one ought to really focus one's mind on.
And for that part, what you point out, this comes from attend to the Lord, right? That's the original idea that's what this is coming from. You should be attending to the Lord, and you're being distracted by all these earthly things.
Yeah.
And then the word discipline, of course, that has a Christian punishment feel to it. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's the same root as disciple. So it's one who follows a certain discipline, right, is a disciple. And discipline has many meanings. Like we could talk about labor discipline, and Marxists have a tradition of talking about how is it that workers are brought under the discipline of factory labor, moral discipline, and then the kinds of punitive discipline that Michel Foucault is so interested in a book like Discipline and Punish, which is one of the kind of theoretical guiding lights for all of my work. So the subtitle of my book, Distraction and Discipline in American Culture, is about the way that discipline, or both the disciplining of others, but also self-discipline, comes to be seen as a way to repair our own minds from the distractedness that they've fallen into. So I'm in a state of distraction. I need someone to discipline me out of it, or I need to discipline myself so that I can recover my powers of attention. And that's what I'm trying to sort of get the history of in the book, is how is it that we came to think about distraction in the ways that we do? And how is it that we came to see discipline or self-discipline as the path toward a way out of distraction? And that, I do think, is there is a line from the 19th century to where we are now. I mean, right now, there's a whole kind of self-help industry of mindfulness and attuning oneself and eliminating distractions. I mean, you can find shelves of books that are about that version of self-help. And I think that's the kind of thing that Thoreau was trying to put himself through when he went to the woods.
So the other way that it's put is that what we're trying to leave, what distraction causes is this, the word is torpid or numb, right? When we are being pulled by these other things, we are numb or torpid. And then the discipline is going to bring about this rebirth, renewal, alertness, freshness. I do see out there that meditation is going to be very helpful to you. I don't know if it's really about leaving numbness and coming to vitality.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think there are versions of kind of reconnecting with nature, reawakening one's senses, becoming more alive to the world that people still pursue. I mean, I myself pursue them. But if we think about the various ways that, I'm a parent now. I have a 9-year-old son, and a lot of what he does in the summer is go to camps where this is sort of the promise. They're going to disconnect. They're going to disconnect them from their screens. They're going to, take them to learn how to look at the natural world. They're going to take them on walks and so on. They're going to reawaken them to the world. So I think there is still that ideal of a reawakening.
It certainly is. Yes. Let's start with you. You start with Thoreau and you end with Thoreau. And the first one, in the beginning, it's the encounter with the snake. And in that, he says he'd like people to rise to a higher and more, to feel the spring of springs and rise to a higher and more ethereal life. I love that. I don't know if I can really think that way. I can think about trying not to be depressed and not to be anxious, but I would like to think about it as a higher and more ethereal life, but it's more of a reach for me maybe than it was at that time.
Yeah. When Thoreau imagines a kind of awakening or coming out of torpor and into wakefulness, or when he imagines sort of becoming undistracted, his language does tend to the spiritual and even the religious. When he says, if we've profaned ourselves by distraction, then the remedy will be by wariness and devotion to reawaken ourselves. And he says, make once more a fane of the mind. We almost never use the word fane, which is a kind of temple. We always say profane, which is to say the secular, the opposite of the spiritual, right? So he is talking about a kind of re-spiritualization, but in a way that is maybe different from the more ancient traditions of spiritual exercises, because at least in his case, it is always going to be happening through his embodied physical interaction with the natural world. So he's not trying to, merely transcend his embodiment, but to kind of like kindle his body back into its receptivity. And that's maybe why torpor and wakefulness are such an important opposition for him.
I'll just read that section here. He says, near the end of March 1845, I borrowed an axe and went down to the woods by Walden Pond, nearest to where I intended to build my house. And they began to cut down some tall, arrowy white pines, still in their youth, for timber. It is difficult to begin without borrowing, but perhaps it is the most generous course, thus to permit your fellow man to have an interest in your enterprise. The owner of the axe, as he released his hold on it, said that it was the apple of his eye, but I returned it sharper than I received it. And I'll skip a little bit. They were pleasant spring days in which the winter of man's discontent was thawing, as well as the earth, and the life that had lain torpid began to stretch itself. One day when my axe had come off and I'd cut a green hickory for a wedge, driving it with a stone, and had placed the hole to soak in a pond hole in order to swell the wood, I saw a striped snake run into the water, and he lay on the bottom, apparently without inconvenience, as long as I stayed there for more than a quarter of an hour, perhaps because he had not yet fairly come out of the torpid state. It appeared to me that for a like reason, men remain in their low and primitive condition, but if they should feel the influence of the spring of springs arousing them, they would of necessity rise to a higher and more ethereal life. What, as you just listen to that today, what does come to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing explicitly in the passage about distraction or about the machine age or about the conditions of technology that are producing this dullness to the world. Instead, he's really thinking through this metaphor of the snake coming out of hibernation. Maybe he's disturbed it, or maybe at his work site, or maybe it's starting to wake up, but it goes into this little warm water and it just kind of sits there, right? And he stands there staring at it because he's killing time while he's waiting to repair his axe. And he speculates about, well, most men, are in this same kind of state of torpor, and they're in this low condition. And he says primitive condition. Although I don't think the opposite of primitive in that moment is civilized.
Right.
In fact, civilization for Thoreau is part of the problem.
Right.
And if they felt the spring of springs, they would rise to a higher and more ethereal life. They would be kind of elevated out of their low torpor, and they would be awakened this kind of way. And so I took kind of a gamble in beginning my book with this passage, and in calling the book Thoreau's Axe, since there's nothing explicitly about distraction in this moment, and it takes a bit of reading between the lines, or maybe even a kind of psychologizing reading of Thoreau. But a lot of what he's talking about there is, I borrowed this axe. I'm a little embarrassed that I had to borrow it because my project is sort of supposed to be about self-sufficiency. And then I was working and I broke this axe that I had borrowed, or I was not careful with my tool. And so I do think there's a kind of touch of shame or embarrassment in this passage that Thoreau is kind of working through by way of the image of the snake that needs to be reawakened, that's in a torpid state. In other parts of Walden and in others of his essays, he's much more explicit, using the terms distraction and attention and talking about reawakening himself. So I don't think that, I'm projecting all of this onto Thoreau, but I am moving it into this passage to read that as a moment about what our distractedness looks and feels like, and what kind of transformation might be possible to bring us out of it.
Yeah, it's been a great way to read this and to think about it. I mean, I know I do feel guilt about being distracted all the time. And sometimes a whole day goes by where it seems like there was no time when I wasn't.
Nah.
It's interesting to think about, what it is that I'm actually looking for other than accomplishing things. What is that attention like? How would you describe it? And I like the idea of renewal or coming out of hibernation. At the end, you talk about another passage. At the end of your book, you talk about another passage with Thoreau's again looking into the water and he's looking at fish, and you contrast it, right?
Yeah, it's wintertime, and he's gone out to get himself a drink. But to get a drink from the pond in winter, he has to first cut through the snow, and then he has to cut through the ice. And he's kneeling there. So he's in a posture of religious devotion, even though he's in this errand to refresh his body by getting a drink of water. And he looks through the water and he sees these fish kind of shimmering there, and they are really at one with the water. And he says, heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads, right? So even though he's looking down, he is looking at something divine, and he's in that posture of devotion. So I do think there's that passage kind of answers the passage with the snake.
And it would seem you can't think about looking at a snake without it not being a pleasant experience. I'm assuming that was true for Thoreau also, right?
Yeah. I don't think he's afraid of the snake, but I think it does introduce all kinds of associations, maybe fear, but also the kind of the serpent from the garden and the sense of being fallen is also coming into play in a passage like that.
And then we can use the axe as a way of thinking about what you are doing when you are going through these exercises. You're kind of cutting away the distractions.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying before, like, what would it be like not to be distracted, or what would one want, right? And one of Thoreau's images for that is maybe this cutting through the snow, then cutting through the ice, so that your perception is clear, so that you're seeing the thing in front of you with less kind of gauze over your eyes and with a greater sense of focus. Focus is one of our kind of metaphors for attentiveness. So I do think that clarified and intensified perception is one of the answers to what people hope for as an alternative to what their experience of distraction is like.
Yes, definitely. So it's interesting. Well, let me just ask. You talk about you're going to awaken in terms of the organization of the book.
Mm.
You're going to use an older, what was it? A devotional
book of devotion.
Book of devotion. I'm just not familiar with that. What I've heard it before. What is that?
Mm-hmm. So, a book of devotion comes out of religious tradition, although there are now modern and secular versions. But the idea is basically that you have often a passage for each day, a passage of scripture with a little bit of commentary, right? And so devotional reading is different from the ordinary kinds of reading we do in the sense that it's designed to be cyclical, right? You read this part on Monday, this part on Tuesday, this part on day 3, and so on. And often it's designed to be repetitive. So you do it each year or you go back to this if it's a 1-month cycle. You might not do it every month, but you might go back to it in times when you feel a need for renewal. So the versions that people of devotional books that these 19th century people were reading and writing would often have either a Bible verse or some religious text together with some meditation or commentary for each day. So, Hannah More's Book of Private Devotion, which is an English writer, but very widely circulated in the United States, is one example that I talk about in the book. The tradition goes back to like spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. He has the 4 sections and seven subsections of each of those 4. And that's the model that I used. So as if you could read, one piece for each day of a 28-day cycle. I write a little bit about this character, this Pennsylvania farmer and school teacher named Abraham Jacobs, who wrote his own book of devotional poetry, 366 poems, one for each day of the year, including each year. But we can trace that through even to Whitman. There's 52 sections of Song of Myself, so you could think there's one for each week of the year. And he says at a certain point in his original preface to Leaves of Grass, he says, read these leaves in the open air every season of every year of your life. So that's the way you're supposed to read Leaves of Grass, not just one time and then you set it down, but you go back to it in this cyclical way and you read a little bit. And the reading is a kind of not just practice of consuming the text, or enjoying it, but actually kind of using it to transform yourself.
Certainly the big book of AA.
There you go. Perfect. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Whitman talking about reading it outdoors. There's this great passage you find. This is a description. The pond is of clear, pure water, about 30 feet in depth and covering 178 acres of land. The ground rises by a gentle acclivity from the shore of the pond to a height which overlooks this beautiful sheet of water and an extent of country beyond, embracing in part the village of Westboro, and gives a very pleasing prospect. There are no manufacturing villages in the vicinity, and the farmhouses are not more numerous than in most of the agricultural towns in the state and, of course, the area. The situation, therefore, is sufficiently retired. This beautiful passage is for what?
Yeah, it's from a report to the Massachusetts state legislature proposing the site for what would become the first state-run juvenile reformatory.
Right. So part of this disciplining and refreshing is often to go through to leave yourself to go to a different place, or to get other people to leave if you're trying to discipline them. You're going out and you're going to a different place. That's part of the process. But I just was struck by that because I would bet that the kids were not actually outdoors that much. My suspicion would be that the facility was in this nice area, but they were not outdoors. Maybe I'm wrong. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, just for a little background on it, I think the kind of paradigm of the scene of crime in the middle 19th century United States is the crowded urban alleyway or theater. So those are the spaces where distraction is happening, and those are the spaces where crime is seen to be festering. Now, the poor are being, crowded into cities by these new economic developments, by the development of the industrial economy and by the transition from indenture and slavery into a wage economy. But that is producing these nightmares that, in these crowded alleyways, around the marketplace, at the theater, at the rum house, like these crowds are gathering, they're scenes of distraction and they're scenes of crime. So what are the alternatives to that? One of them is this, what you've just been describing, this rustic situation, which, my point about it is that the description of the pond there sounds a lot like some of Thoreau's descriptions of Walden and the other ponds, and that the program of discipline for these juvenile delinquents is eerily resonant with the program of self-discipline that Thoreau is imposing on himself. The other alternative is the solitary confinement cell, right? Which can be in a city, it can be in a big institutional setting, but it's taking the person out of the crowdedness, and it's an extreme exercise in what can enter their attention, right? Because only what's on the walls of the cell or only what's inside the cell can become, the material for their consciousness. So solitary confinement cell, in its relation to the history of monasticism and monastic solitude as a kind of spiritual self-cultivation by removing all distractions from yourself. Were these kids outside? They did agricultural labor at the reformatory. And there was a whole movement to take these kids, many of whom, by the way, were the children of Irish immigrant laborers. That was a huge urban population in the period that I'm writing about. And to send them on, or sometimes called orphan trains, where they would actually be shipped out into the sort of frontier settlements and go work on a farm or be adopted by a family, so that, the rural life and agricultural labor would do these good things for them spiritually, where they were being corrupted and corroded by urban space. And in fact, the kind of paradigm that Foucault writes about in Discipline and Punish, the juvenile reformatory at Mettray in France, was called an agricultural colony. So they were working in farm labor. So there is a version of this that's about putting people to work outside, usually doing farm work. In the United States, that has a more complicated and stigmatized kind of atmosphere around it because of the slave plantation as the scene of agricultural work outside. And so no one is really buying into the idea that, doing enforced agricultural labor outside is, spiritually uplifting or something like that.
No, absolutely. And I kept thinking about that while I was reading. And when we talk about distraction, and so there was this idea that you're being distracted by, if you're trying to attend to the Lord, you're being distracted by worldly pleasures. If you're trying to become a better citizen, you're distracted by the alleys and the modernity. And before industrialization, before urbanization, I was just trying to imagine whether people were concerned about the same thing. I know that's not the topic of your book. I don't know if I just raise it as a question.
Yeah, I mean, the 19th century is not the beginning of worries about distraction, right? And I think there are two kind of prevailing ways of thinking about this among people who have written about it and studied it. And one of them is, which is true in its way, like we are right now distracted as no one has ever been before in history. And our mediascape does put us in a position where that has a kind of extreme intensity about it. The other story that is sometimes told by people who study ancient spiritual exercises or religious traditions is like, distraction's always been a concern, right? It's a perennial part of social life, of human life, of the effort to improve ourselves. And you can go back to, classical texts, or to St. Paul saying, attend upon the Lord without distraction, or to monastic traditions, which are all about, I'm going to remove myself from the world so that I can focus on God. So the story I tell in my book is a little bit different, which is to say something did happen in the 19th century. And a specific thing that the specific transformation that I'm trying to track is that, and I do it mostly in that first section called From the Devil to Distraction, which is to say, yes, people had been concerned about distraction for a long time, but it was really in the 19th century that they began to say the social and economic and technological conditions of our society are rendering us distracted. Not that in a universal way, but because of this mass media, because of this marketplace, because of this factory labor, because the noise of machines and all of that. And so it's not that we are distracted by the devil, and it's not that our human nature is essentially distracted. In fact, this is now comes to be seen as a corruption of our human nature, rather than as an enactment of our human nature, right? And what we want is actually to get back to our more natural way of being, rather than to transcend our embodied nature. So that's a real change. It's a different kind of distraction, even though it's using the same term and it has a lot in common with the other one. There is a kind of dawning critical social sense or a critical political and economic sense of what's the matter with us? How did we get here, right? And yet, part of the story that the book tells is that in our culture, at least in the United States, even though there's a dawning sense that the economy and social life are structured in such a way that we are damaged spiritually and psychically, the solution always seems to devolve back into this disciplinary version of improving the self.
Right. And you said in the beginning that one thing to look at is the hypocrisy, but another issue that's maybe deeper is kind of the splintering of the self. Were you thinking about Whitman there?
I'm trying to think about that moment. I guess, I think what I was trying to get at in that passage, if I remember the one you're talking about, has to do with...
Let me just read it. It says, not just uncovering hypocrisy, complicity between power and attention, worse, splintering, and the way beyond being not purifying, but being out in the world.
Yeah. So I think when I say the point of the book is not to just call out hypocrisy or expose hypocrisy. That it is part of what I'm saying is that there is a kind of double movement where people are exposed to these forces that cause their distraction and in the same gesture held responsible for being distracted because they haven't disciplined themselves in the right way. So I did want to critique that. I did want to sort of show that. And the career of thinking with Foucault's account of discipline really prepared me to do a critique of the disciplines of attention and to show how the very thing that so many of us are often trying to impose on ourselves, impose on our children, impose on our students and so on, might have this darker side, this coercive aspect to it.
Absolutely. It's very well taken. I feel it.
And yet, there was another way in which the whole problem of distraction brought me up against what I felt to be sort of like the limit of how I can use that Foucauldian line of thinking. Because for all that I can do this critique of it, nonetheless, there does have to be a kind of work on ourselves and work with and on each other in order to become attentive to any social or political problem, and in order to organize around it, and in order to sort of see clearly and truly the conditions of our own existence. And so you can't simply discard the whole project of self-discipline. And even Foucault himself didn't finally wish to discard it, or rather, that's exactly what he turned to at the end of his career as well, when he started writing about the arts of existence and spiritual exercises. So what would it look like to do a kind of self-discipline or self-culture that was as free as possible or as distant as possible from these larger mechanisms and systems of coercion. That was kind of the question there.
Is there, I don't know about Foucault, but is there an idea of overcoming distraction without the guilt part of it? Just throw that out there.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that that's one of the good things about political and economic and social analysis of the conditions of our distraction is that we stop seeing it as so sort of culpably our fault.
Yeah.
And so, having some political analysis and having some sense that all of us are subjected to these systems that are doing these things to us might kind of take it out of moralism in that way and turn it into more of a political project.
Right. So for the listeners, we have these 4 parts, and the first is from the devil to distraction, in terms of what was happening at that time period. What was this thing that was distracting us? Part 2, reform. Part 3, revival. Part 4, devotion. And in each part, as Caleb Smith said, it has 7 different passages with comments, and these are great passages. You've got Whitman Dickinson. You've got the section from Beloved by Toni Morrison, Melville, Poe, and Frederick Douglass. So there's just great little sections. Now, and then you talk about each one, and I feel so. One time when my kids are older now, but one time when my son was in middle school, and he was given an assignment and he wasn't doing it, and I just decided I would just do it for him. And I just wrote it and I sent it. And then when I got it back, the teacher said, this is really no good. This is, you really have to have a thesis statement here. Right. I like this because I don't feel like you're free to talk about different things and not make things fit. Is that your style, or is that something you were trying to do here?
This for me is related to this kind of shape of the book of devotion, that sort of rather than assimilating each of these passages as evidence of a claim that I would work out in kind of monograph style chapters, I would do it in this more modular or shorter form where some of the kind of ambivalence and strangeness and contradiction of my thinking, but also of the thinking that I find in each of the passages could sort of be left unresolved. And it gives the reader the possibility to kind of move around in the book. You don't have to read them in sequence for them to make sense. You can make your own patterns. And so maybe in some ways, even though the book of devotion is designed to kind of reawaken us or intensify our sense of devotion, it's also suited to distracted readers that, you can read a few pages at a time. You don't have to kind of make your way through a 30-page or 10,000 word chapter or something like that. But for me, it was really, I think, a form suited to that ambivalence that I have about these disciplines of attention, and a form that allowed me to bring out, without trying to kind of force into resolution, the contradictions, the unresolved questions that some of these passages raise.
Absolutely. Some of this was pretty emotional to read. I think for me, the last 2, The Valves of Her Attention by Emily Dickinson, and Aroma, Fire Than Prayer, the sections and also your discussions of them. Let me just read a little bit of The Valves of Her Attention. It's such a beautiful discussion you have of it. But from the poem, I've known her from an ample nation, choose one. Then close the valves of her attention like stone. So profound. Well, I don't know. As you are sitting here today, there's so much to say about it. What comes to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about the rising to a higher and more ethereal life passage from Thoreau, and that's a passage about, what might happen if we rose from distraction to attentiveness, or what kind of self-transformation might attention make possible. And I think Dickinson is describing that, right? Like it's the soul has selected one, has chosen one who's going to be the kind of precious, privileged object of her attention, and then closes the valves of her attention like stone. So unimpressionable by anything from the outside, so focused on this one object of attention and devotion. But part of what I came to see the longer I thought and wrote about that passage was how it's not kind of written from the point of view of the soul that's doing this act of attention. It's written from the point of view of someone on the outside who's watching it happen and seeing someone become kind of unavailable to you because they're so fixated on something else, because their attention is so turned to this one thing. And the sense of loneliness that someone on the outside has from watching that turn and that closing down, that stoniness that now presents itself to the outside. I think the coldness of the cold beauty of the poem is about that feeling.
No, it's true. And I've known her. I don't know what she's talking about, herself or someone that she's looking at. She's looking at someone else who's she's looking from the outside at someone else, right?
Yeah. I mean, the soul selects her own society. So the soul is the she in the poem.
And then this lovely, well, not lovely, this shocking. I believe in the flesh and the appetites. Seeing, hearing, and feeling are miracles, and each part and tag of me is a miracle. Divine am I inside and out, and I will make holy whatever I touch, where I'm touched from. The scent of these armpits is aroma finer than prayer. This head is more than churches or Bibles or creeds.
Yeah. I'm reading that passage as a kind of inversion or reversal of a whole long tradition of Christian ascetic spiritual exercises that had to do with repressing the appetites, turning away from the body in order to focus on the divine. And when Whitman imagines how a person might be transformed by an awakening of their attention, it's not that at all, right? It's this enlivening and intensification of their own embodied experience. His body itself becomes the kind of object of his worship. And so the sweat from his armpits is like the incense in this church, and the head is like the temple. And
Right.
It's a kind of intensification of his own embodiment.
You can't read it without, I'm assuming even at that time, you can't read it without realizing it's also saying the opposite, I think.
Right. Well, what it's saying is that these seeming opposites are not. It is about transcending that antagonism between the appetites and the spiritual. And, I think we were talking about the valves of her attention a minute ago. One of the phrases, I don't write about this in the book, but in thinking about it, getting ready to talk to you, I was thinking about comparing it maybe to that famous line from William Blake, the doors of perception, valves of attention. But in Blake, when the doors of perception are cleansed, things are going to appear to us as they truly are, infinite. But part of what we're going to see when the doors of perception are cleansed is that the body and the soul are not distinct from each other. They're not separate from each other. And I think Whitman is in that vein here, that there's a kind of sacralization of the body that is the end point of this, full awakening. That's why you got to go outside to read these leaves in the open air every season of every year of your life, so that you can be in your own embodiment and in contact with the world in this way. Not at all transcending the world, not leaving the world behind, but feeling it in your sensual embodiment.
Right. No, that meant a lot to me. I appreciate the book, and I appreciate your talking with me today. Thoreau's Acts, Distraction and Discipline in American Culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, August. I appreciate it.
Bye.